the origin of their belief in the resurrection, contrary to Jewish beliefs. Secondly, the New Testament consistently draws a distinction between resurrection appearances of Christ and mere visions of Christ. The appearances of Christ ceased after a brief period of time, but visions of Christ continued on in the early church, and in Muslim nations, many people still have visions of Christ today, through which they've come to believe in him. But these aren't resurrection appearances. How can you explain the difference unless the appearances were in fact bodily, physical appearances, not mere visions? Finally, two theological objections to Shabir's point. Number one, it comes too late to assume Jesus into heaven when he's already in the tomb. He's already suffered humiliation, suffering, and shame. And there is no point now in rescuing the prophet when he's laid in the tomb more than half dead. It's too little too late. But secondly, his hypothesis turns God into a deceiver who fooled the disciples into believing Jesus was risen from the dead, so that they went out and preached his resurrection, thus foisting Christianity upon the world and fostering this deception that has led to a third of the world's population being Christian. So his hypothesis turns God into a deceiver, which is theologically unobjectionable. For these four reasons, I don't think that Shabir's hypothesis works. On the contrary, I really believe it's a hypothesis of desperation, and if he is open to the truth, I think he will come to believe in the resurrection of Jesus from the dead.
Hello again. Yes, Dr. Craig, I am still open to the truth and I'm listening. Let me see what you have said about the Jesus of the Quran. Basically, you have said, yeah, the Jesus of the Quran is not difficult to believe in because in any case he's so bland that anyone can believe in him. And, okay, so I believe in a bland Jesus, but at least I believe in him. But I believe that that Jesus is more than just a bland Jesus. He is a prophet, a messenger. He's one of the mighty messengers of God. And I believe that he is God's Messiah. He's not the Davidic Messiah. If he were the Davidic Messiah, he couldn't die. But he was a prophet Messiah. The Dead Sea Scrolls, as reported in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary on page 1323, affirm that the Jewish expectation had a looking forward to three different Messiahs: a prophet Messiah, a priestly Messiah, and a Davidic Messiah. Notice that the Gospels have Jesus representing all three somehow, but if he were the Davidic Messiah, he could not die. If he were the Davidic Messiah, he had to sit on the throne and rule over Israel. This we know he has not done. So Jesus in the Quran, to me, is a great Jesus, and I believe in him and I love him. Now, are there any objections to my proposal that Jesus did not die on the cross? Dr. Craig thinks that there are some objections. Why would the disciples proclaim the resurrection of Jesus? Well, in answer to that, I say that we do not in fact know what exactly the disciples preached, even though many people may be confident already that we do know. But recall, what we read about the disciples is in the Acts of the Apostles, a document which, according to Raymond Brown, was written around the year 85. In fact, there is a widespread scholarly consensus of a date somewhere between 80 and 90. This would make it about 55 years after the crucifixion. And it is said that the gospel, or rather the author of Acts of the Apostles, wrote down not historically what the disciples actually preached, but what Luke in his day thought that the disciples would have preached. Naturally, the preaching is stylized according to the later Christian belief that has evolved towards the end of the first Christian century. But when we study these reports, we look for things which are there, which rub against the grain. And we think that the writer did not have a personal interest in reporting that. If we look at these reports, we see that the preaching of the earliest disciples used as a core a reference to the 16th Psalm. And when you go to that psalm, we see that this psalm actually speaks about somebody who had a close brush with death, but didn't die. For example, the New Jerusalem Bible, in a footnote on page 827, says that his lively faith and total commitment to God called for a union that defies dissolution. Hence, he must pray to escape death, which would break that union. Moreover, the New Jerome Biblical Commentary explains the meanings of the key Hebrew words there. And further on, We read in the Interpreter's one-volume commentary on the Bible, and this is important. Speaking about the psalmist here, it says, after a close brush with death, the poet rejoices, and so on. So I take it that the earliest belief was that in fact Jesus did escape death. No, he did not die. So we cannot say that we know that the disciples proclaimed the resurrection from the dead. What is more likely is that the disciples proclaimed that after Jesus had been put on the cross, Jesus is now alive again. Now, Dr. Craig says these were not mere visions. Well, whatever they were, whatever the disciples experienced, on that one occasion that Raymond Brown talks about, it is possible that the disciples saw a vision which was so strong, which was so convincing, which was so assuring that Jesus is alive, that they were able to go forward and proclaim their faith in the Christ. Muslim commentators on the Quran, in Surah 3, verse number 55, where it says, إِذْ قَالَ اللَّهُ يَا عِيسَى إِنِّي مُتَوَفِّيكَ وَرَافِعُكَ إِلَيَّ When God said, "Oh Jesus, I'm going to take you and raise you to myself," Muslim commentators have said that this refers to God raising Jesus into heaven, after which God granted a vision to the disciples because they were saddened at the parting of the Messiah and they wanted to be satisfied. God satisfied them by showing them a vision of the Messiah. So with that vision, they were not deceived. We do not believe that God deceived the disciples, but we believe that God rescued Jesus from the plots of the enemies. And if anyone failed, and if anyone had their plots turned against them, it is the enemy. And they just simply got what they deserved. But on the other hand, the disciples of Jesus had the satisfaction that they needed. Dr. Craig says, well, wait a minute, there would be no point to letting Jesus suffer a part of the way on the cross and then saving him. But notice that in Christian theology, Jesus suffered all of the way and then God saved him. So I do not feel that there is any rational objection here to the Muslim understanding that God rescued Jesus and saved him from his enemies. Now Dr. Craig says that he had put out 3 facts, and to his fact number 1, he was surprised that I did not reply. He said Jesus made all these claims which amount to blasphemy in the Old Testament law. But notice that I did reply to that in 2 ways. First, in presenting the Muslim understanding, I presented Jesus, who has to be understood as a historical person who lived in Palestine and who was well within the Jewish tradition. He could not have preached something which is radically different from the faith which was represented by the prophet Moses before him. And so Jesus could not have made these radical claims. It would just be theologically impossible from that point of view. Second, if Jesus had actually made these claims, then we're starting with a Christ who blasphemed. And once he died the death of a blasphemer, there would be no reason to believe in him. But the only reason we can believe in Jesus is because we know that Jesus is true and he did not blaspheme. Notice that if you take the view that he had blasphemed and he died as a blasphemer, there is no reason for thinking that God would want to raise him from the dead. And yet, in Dr. Craig's best apology for the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, he admits that the weakest part of his hypothesis is it is ad hoc in that it assumes that God exists. It is not a historical hypothesis. It is not a naturalistic hypothesis. He says that it would be so impossible for Jesus to just simply spontaneously come back to life that you may as well suppose that E.T. came and stole away his body. But only on the hypothesis that God exists can you assert now that God raised Jesus back to life. It is a theological hypothesis. But I would like to add and clarify, not only do we need for God to exist, but we have to have a God who wants to raise Jesus back from the dead. And if you have a man who died as a blasphemer, according to your explanation, then on what theological basis should we assert that God would want to raise this person back to life? Notice what Dr. Craig has said. By raising Jesus back to life, God had actually vindicated all of the claims of this man. And God is showing that what he said was actually true. But if God gave a law which says that if a man comes and makes these claims, he's a blasphemer, and then a man comes and makes those claims, then according